funny to me that something so simple can be so game-changing. For years, I gardened in little beds. I gardened in dog beds. I gardened in perennial beds. I gardened in food forests. I've done all kinds of different gardening, and a lot of those things I still use. But going back in time and growing things in single rows, it's game-changing. And it's the silliest thing. I mean, you think, like, that's the old way to do it. That's the boring way to do it. It's outdated, it's outmoded, it wastes too much space. It's not great. It's like, well, Grandpa used to do that, but Grandpa also threw around, triple 13 or whatever. You can do a soil building garden organically, just like this. You don't have to add chemicals. You don't have to use pesticides. And you'll find that by spacing it this wide, you have to irrigate a lot less. So what I was just using was my wheel hoe. And a wheel hoe, I think, is if you're going to have a garden beyond a certain size and you're going to use rows, if you have pathways, the wheel hoe is the single most efficient tool that I have ever used. It's probably 5 to 10 times faster than using a regular garden hoe. It is a human-powered tool. It is appropriate technology, as I've heard it said, right? So it's a human-powered, simple tool. The force goes down towards that little wheel, and a blade decapitates the weeds, and you can just walk and clean it up. Now, I know some people are going to be like, well, you said you can build soil. It looks like you just have a bunch of bare dirt back there. From what I've seen and what I've read, you have to pile tons of mulch on the ground to build soil. Well, that's not true. You can build soil through cover crops. So in between these periods of it being in rows and crops, you can allow the ground to rejuvenate itself and to grow back and to get bunches of life and carbon and nitrogen and everything else by cover cropping in between. And you've seen some of my seed mixes where I throw some things around. I usually like to have a brassica, a grain, and a legume together, often with some other stuff like buckwheat, to add a lot of carbon to the ground and add nitrogen at the same time, plus to confuse the pests and to make biomass, and sometimes we get a yield out of it too. But if you're tilling that stuff underneath, you are building the soil. And remember that a lot of your vegetables, a lot of your annuals like bacterially dominated soils. You've probably heard about that. Fungally dominated versus bacterially dominated. A mulch garden is a fungally dominated system. Lots and lots of food for the fungi. A cover crop and till, repeat till type of a system is bacterially dominated. So, do I do no-till? Yes. I have no-till areas. My grocery row gardening system is basically a series of straight food forest strips, living hedges of life. And then I have this bacterially dominated system right back here, which is the most ridiculous powerhouse for producing food for the family that I've done. It's ridiculous that it is so easy and it's so old-fashioned that I overlooked it forever. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna show you how I'm building soil in between so you can get an idea of how much life is actually going into the ground when it's not just this bare dirt and strips of vegetables. This area right here, we ran the chickens through. So, in permaculture, there's a lot of talk of integrating your animals and your food production together. I mean, think of Justin Rhodes. The other day somebody said, hey, your run and gun vlogs are a lot like Justin Rhodes. And I thought, that's great. Hey, I'm getting compared to Justin Rhodes. Justin's awesome. So his permaculture chickens, right? You run the chickens through an area and you garden on top of it. So what we did was we ran the chickens through in their tractor through this whole area, and now there's this big swoop of green along the edge where it used to just be some grass on some patchy sand. And now we have this incredible carpet of green. And this is because after they went through, we sowed this area with winter ryegrass and clover. My daughter just came out here and threw the seeds over this area, and then as it's rained a few times, they've all come up. There's a ton of life here. I didn't even get around to putting a brassica in it, and there's already so much life we don't know what to do with it. So what do you think happens in the spring when you take all this beautiful material and you till it under? Look at all this carbon and nitrogen and nutrients and life and all the bacteria that's going to feed on that soft material. We're not tilling under brown, high carbon materials. We're tilling stuff under that's full of life, and it's going to deteriorate rapidly, and it's going to become humus, and it will feed the plants almost immediately. This right here is next year's food, or even this spring's food, months from now. And we got to use our animals. The animals fed on the grass that went through here, and if we wanted to, we could run the chickens right through here again, let them chew this stuff down and manure it, and then it'll grow back again and we'll get even more life in it. You can build life very well in a system with tillage. So don't let the dogma control your mind. There was a reason in the past that people grew these wide row gardens, and people knew about cover cropping. Everything goes in cycles through history, and there are periods of time where this thing catches on or that thing catches on. And sometimes I think it makes sense to say, how did they do it 500 years ago? How did they do it 1,000 years ago? How did they do it 3,000 years ago? What do we know? What was done in this area? How was it done? And try those methods. Sometimes we have legitimately come up with something that seems like it's really new and it works really, really well. But often things tend to revert to older systems for a reason. It's because generations and generations of men and women tried and tested these things, and they just work. These beds right here are no-till. The pathways right now are being tilled. But I was talking to Sam from Scrubland Farms, and he said I ought to go and put a cover crop through these beds in between these grocery row gardens. These beds don't get turned up except for when I'm planting some new seeds in them. They don't get tilled under again. They are permanent. They're perennial. This is where my perennial fungally dominated soils are, where I put down wood chips and leaves and pine needles and that sort of thing to build a leaf mold layer that is full of life and improve the soil long-term, long, slow connections around those roots. But he was saying, why not put in some seed mixes down these and make narrow chicken tractors where the chickens could eat their way through the center, and then you get one more use out of the system. And I think that idea is great, and I'm going to play around with that. But for now, I want you to see, I don't hate no-till. I just think we've got this huge toolkit. My single-row gardens are producing tons of food without me hauling a massive amount of mulch back there and piling it on the ground. And I've had people in this area tell me their deep mulch gardens, they are unable to direct seed in them because there are so many pests and so much life living in that mulch that new seedlings are massacred. I don't want that. I want to just be able to go down a row and sprinkle, cover it over, thin it out, weed in between those rows with my wheel hoe or my regular hoe, and pull out lots of food. I don't want to have to regularly water. I don't have to, because they're not tightly planted. Tons of space, tons of water in the ground, and it's plenty of space to breathe. They're the prettiest looking crops that I have grown in a long time. And so when I come on YouTube and tell you guys, I'm not going to tell you that what I figured out is the very best thing for all circumstances and all places forever and ever, amen. No. Just want you guys to see the experiments that I'm doing and think them through. Could that work for you? Do you have space for it? Is it worth trying? Is it worth gardening like Grandpa did? Will you find it to be a game changer? Or will you come back and say, you know what? My square foot garden system worked really well. I'm really happy with that, and I'm going back to that. You don't know unless you try. And part of the fun of gardening is trying new things every year. And if the Lord gave us this much space to play around with, I've got my no-till section. I've got my John Jeevons beds over there. I've got my mixed up garden over here. I've got some multiple trees planted in single holes over here, and I've got some grapes way back there, and then I've got single rows all way out there in the field where the worst soil is, the farthest away from the house, farthest away from irrigation, so I'm counting on the rain, and they're all in bits and pieces. So don't throw out anything that might be useful to you. And I'm telling you, in this poor soil, fast draining, we got more space than we have fertility. And the single row gardening method is definitely working and really easy to take care of. If you want to organically feed your single row gardens, it's hard to beat worm tea. That is just the exudate, what drains out of your worm bin, right? So it's full of nutrients and bacteria. I filled this watering can halfway up with water first, and now I'm going to put all of this life-filled, nutrient-rich tea into it. You could also use fish emulsion, ashes, compost, manure tea, comfrey tea, moringa tea. You could use Dave's fetid swamp water. You could even use diluted urine, 6 parts water to 1 part urine. If you have acid soil, add more ashes. But when you make your rows, you can go down and sprinkle the rows with whatever you want. There's plenty of organic options. Just because you are gardening in rows, it doesn't mean you have to go chemical farming. And remember, our ancestors weren't chemical farming. They were using manure. Lots and lots of manure and ashes. Easy. So mostly what I want to say today is, new is not necessarily better. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't knock it till you tried it. Basically, we're looking at victory gardens here. Pretty simple stuff. And you can handle it. It's not hard. Now, if you like the no-till permaculture approach like I've got going in the grocery row gardens, totally check out my book, Grocery Row Gardening. But at some point, I'm going to go and write a book on single row gardening because, like I said, it's game changing. Good ideas have a way of coming back around again. And maybe a little weird. I may seem a little old-fashioned. And maybe that's good. Get y'all next time. Until then, may your thumbs always be green.